Beneath the cold, sapphire light of the moon, every secret eventually finds its way to the surface of reality. We capture the fleeting moments of truth that define who we are in the darkest hours. Hit subscribe now and let the light reveal the mystery to you.
The night my brother-in-law's father stood up from his chair, pointed at my boyfriend, and said, "Is that really you?" The entire room held its breath. 43 people. Crystal glasses still raised. My mother's lipstick smile frozen in place. And me, sitting at the far end of the table where they had put me, next to the coatroom, pretending I didn't notice. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire. I'm 28 years old and I have been a paramedic for 6 years. I work 48-hour shifts. I have held a stranger's hand while they took their last breath in the back of an ambulance on a Tuesday night, and then I have driven back to the station, made a pot of coffee, and started my next shift at 6 in the morning. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because it matters to this story. It matters more than my family ever thought it did. My older sister, Vanessa, is a corporate attorney at a firm downtown. She graduated top of her class, made partner at 31, and has been my mother's favorite topic of conversation at every family gathering for the past decade. My parents are both in finance. My father runs his own investment consulting firm. My mother sits on the board of 2 nonprofits, which she mentions approximately every 40 minutes. They live in a house with a formal dining room. They use maybe 6 times a year, a wine cellar my father gives tours of, and a circle of friends who measure each other in job titles and zip codes. I chose paramedic work after 2 years of pre-med because I realized I didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to be the one who got there first. My parents never fully understood the distinction. My father called it a detour. My mother said, "We just want more for you, sweetheart," in a tone that meant the opposite. My boyfriend's name is Marcus. I met him at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning 18 months ago. Not a cute little weekend market with artisan candles and overpriced jam. A real one, where actual farmers come before dawn to unload actual produce. I was buying sweet potatoes because I had a double shift coming up and I needed something I could actually cook. He was at a booth selling honey and dried herbs, and he was wearing a worn flannel shirt and had mud on one of his boots. And he was explaining the difference between wildflower and clover honey to an elderly woman with the kind of patience that made me stop walking entirely. I stood there for a while. He noticed eventually. He smiled. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about nothing important. The honey, the weather, whether a farmer's market sweet potato was actually worth the extra $1. He wrote his number on the back of a produce receipt. I called him 3 days later. He told me he worked in agriculture. I told him I drove an ambulance. We laughed about how neither of us had become what our families expected. We got dinner. Then another dinner. Then I stopped counting dinners and started just thinking of him as the person I wanted to talk to at the end of every shift. I never asked him a lot of questions about his work. That sounds strange now, but it made sense at the time. When you do what I do, you come home wanting to think about something other than work. Marcus was the same. We talked about books and terrible reality television, and whether certain regional barbecue styles were genuinely different or just marketing. He mentioned his family's land in passing, said he had been running things since his father stepped back a few years ago, said there were some projects in the works. I didn't push. He had a quiet way of telling you exactly as much as he wanted you to know. When Vanessa got engaged to her boyfriend, my parents planned a celebration dinner the way they planned everything to impress. 43 guests. A private room at Hendrick's, which is the kind of restaurant that doesn't list prices on the menu. Vanessa's fiancé, whose name is Brett, came from a family my parents had been trying to connect with for years. His father, a man named Robert Calloway, had built something significant in the agricultural technology space. That was how my mother described it. The agricultural technology space, in the same voice she used when she wanted you to know something was important. I was told about the dinner 3 weeks in advance. I told my mother I would bring Marcus. She paused just long enough to make it meaningful. And then said, "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable." I asked Marcus if he wanted to come. He said, "Sure." Just that. Sure. No nervousness, no asking what to wear, no questions about whether my parents liked him. He had met them twice before, briefly, at my apartment, and both times my father had asked him about his work, and then changed the subject when Marcus said farming. The way you change the subject when someone gives the wrong answer to a question. We arrived at Hendrix at 7. Marcus wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt. He looked exactly like himself, which I had learned meant he was comfortable. My mother air-kissed me at the entrance and looked Marcus up and down and said, "So glad you could make it." Which is the thing she says when she's not glad. My father shook Marcus's hand and said, "Good to see you again. Still out there on the land?" He said, "The land. The way some people say, the circus." "Still out there," Marcus said, and smiled, and didn't add anything else. The seating arrangement told me everything I needed to know. Vanessa and Brett sat at the center of the long table, flanked by both sets of parents. The senior partners from Brett's family firm were nearby. A federal judge my father knew from his club was given the third seat from the center. My mother's two closest friends, both married to surgeons, were on the other side. Marcus and I were at the far end, near the entrance to the kitchen, next to Brett's younger cousin who was still in college and seemed confused about why he was there. I knew what it meant. I had known my whole life what it meant when my mother designed a seating chart. She organized the world by what she believed people were worth. She wasn't cruel about it. She would have been offended if you called it cruelty. She just believed certain things. The way people believe in gravity. Automatically, without examining it, as though it were simply the nature of things. The appetizers came. The wine was poured. My father stood up to give the first toast, the way he always did at things like this. Because he believed standing up to speak was a right you earned by being important. He talked about Vanessa for 3 minutes. Her achievements, her firm, her judgment, her future. Every sentence landed like an award being placed on a shelf. People nodded and smiled. Brett's mother looked genuinely moved. The federal judge raised his glass. Then my father looked down the table at me. It wasn't a warm look. It was the look he used when he wanted to acknowledge something in a way that also minimized it. "And our Claire," he said. And the room shifted in that way. Rooms do when the speaker's tone shifts. Still out there saving the day in her ambulance. A few people chuckled. Not unkindly, the way you might think. It was the chuckle of people who found something slightly charming but not particularly serious. My mother smiled tightly. Vanessa looked at her plate. "We're very proud of all our children," my father said, in a voice that made it clear he was performing the sentence rather than meaning it. And then he raised his glass to Vanessa and Brett and sat down. Marcus's hand found mine under the table. I hadn't realized I had made a fist. I didn't say anything. This is something I had learned over years of working in emergency medicine. The difference between situations that require your immediate response and situations that require you to wait. I had learned to read rooms the way I read patients. I knew the difference between a wound that needed pressure and one that needed time. But something shifted in me that night that hadn't shifted before. It wasn't the first time my father had minimized my work. It wasn't the first time my mother had put me at the wrong end of the table. It was the first time, though, that I felt the full weight of it clearly, without excusing it, without explaining it away. 43 people. My father's voice. That chuckle. Marcus's hand finding mine. I excused myself to the restroom somewhere around the main course. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror and thought, I have intubated a 17-year-old boy on the side of the highway who was alive when we arrived at the hospital. Because of exactly what I did in those 4 minutes. My father thinks that's worth a polite chuckle at the children's end of the table. I dried my hands. I walked back out. I sat down next to Marcus and ate my dinner. It was near the end of the meal, when the dessert menus had been placed and the conversation had loosened into the comfortable noise of expensive occasions. That Robert Calloway, Brett's father, the man who had built something significant in the agricultural technology space, leaned back in his chair and looked down the length of the table. He had been quiet most of the evening, a trim man in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of steady attention in his eyes that you notice because most people at events like this are performing instead of watching. He was watching Marcus. I noticed it first because I was watching Marcus too. The way you watch someone you love in a room that doesn't know what to do with them. Marcus was talking to Brett's college-age cousin about something. I caught the word irrigation, and he was using his hands the way he did when he was genuinely interested in explaining something. Robert Calloway leaned toward Brett and said something quietly. Brett looked at Marcus. Then Robert stood up, which was unusual enough that people nearby noticed, and he walked the length of the table, which was unusual enough that everyone noticed. He stopped behind Marcus's chair. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. He had a voice that rooms listened to. "But I have to ask, are you Marcus Webb?" Marcus turned around. He looked at Robert Calloway the way he looked at everything, calmly, without performance. "I am," he said. Robert Calloway looked at my father for a moment. Then he looked at my mother. Then he looked back at Marcus and said, "Do you know that your drought resistance program saved my family's entire operation in the San Joaquin Valley 3 years ago? Every acre. We had already started contingency planning for total loss." He paused. "I have been trying to find the right way to thank the Webb Foundation for 2 years. I had no idea." He gestured, unable to finish the sentence. The room was absolutely silent. My father set down his wine glass. My mother's hand stopped moving halfway to her water. I watched my father's face do something I had never seen it do at a social occasion. It went through several expressions in rapid succession. None of them composed. Marcus stood and shook Robert's hand. He said, "The team deserves the credit. I just directed the funding." He said it simply, the way he said most things. Robert shook his head. "The Webb Foundation committed $12 million to a program that every other major agricultural fund had declined. You didn't just fund it, you championed it for 3 years before it worked." He looked at the room. He wasn't performing. He was just telling the truth. There are 400 farming families in Central California who have no idea how close they came to losing everything, and no idea who helped pull them back. Vanessa made a small sound. Brett was looking at his father with an expression I couldn't fully read. The federal judge leaned toward his wife and whispered something. My mother said softly, "Marcus, we didn't know." He turned to her with perfect, courteous stillness and said, "You never asked. It wasn't cruel." He didn't raise his voice. He just said it, and it sat in the room like something that had always been true. Dinner ended the way these things end, when the center of gravity shifts, and no one knows quite how to redistribute themselves. There was handshaking and coat collecting and a kind of collective adjustment. The way a group of people resorts itself after realizing they've been facing the wrong direction. Robert Calloway sought me out before we left. He shook my hand and said, "Marcus talks about you. You know, he told me you were a paramedic. Said you were the most competent person he'd ever watched work." He smiled. I believed him. I didn't know what to say for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you, that means a lot." My father found me by the coat check. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something and then forgotten it. "Claire," he said. "I didn't realize." "I know," I said. "Your work?" "We've never said enough." "No," I said. "You haven't." I said it without heat. Just the way things were. I had learned something in 6 years of emergency medicine about the difference between a conversation that changes something and a conversation that performs change. This one, in a coat check alcove on the night of my sister's engagement dinner, was not the time for the real one. "We can talk," I told him, "but not tonight." He nodded. He seemed relieved, which told me a lot. My mother hugged me at the door. It was a tighter hug than usual, which I recognized as an apology in her language. I let her. Marcus and I drove home mostly in silence, the comfortable kind. Somewhere on the highway he said, "I should have told your parents more about the foundation. That's on me." "Why didn't you?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted to know if they would be decent to me before they had a reason to be. I thought about that for a long time. He looked over at me and said, "They weren't. And neither were they decent to you. Those are two separate things, and the second one matters a lot more to me." I didn't have anything to add to that. In the weeks after the dinner, things shifted. My parents called more. My father asked, for the first time with genuine curiosity rather than politeness, what my shifts were actually like. My mother told her friend that her younger daughter was in emergency medicine, which was new. I noticed these things and I let them be what they were. Small, imperfect, early. Vanessa called me the morning after and talked for an hour. She told me she had known for years that our parents handled things badly with me, and that she had told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. She said she was sorry. It was the most honest conversation we had had in a decade, and I was glad to have it. I did something that same week that I had been putting off for a long time. I told my mother directly, not in the heat of an argument, not in the wake of a particular incident, but in a regular phone call, that the way I had been treated at family events for years had hurt me, that the seating chart, the tone, the chuckle at Hendrix, that it added up to something real, and that I needed her to understand that. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "I didn't think of it that way." "I know," I said, "that's part of what I'm telling you." She said, "I'm listening." My father and I had a longer conversation. Harder, 2 weeks later. It went the way hard conversations go. Unevenly, with backtracking, with moments of defensiveness, followed by moments of genuine reckoning. I told him about the night I kept a man alive in a parking structure for 11 minutes until backup arrived. I told him about the family who sent me a card a year later. I told him that I didn't need him to have chosen this work for me. I just needed him to see that I had chosen it, and that it was real, and that it was mine. He cried. My father, who wore his composure like a suit, cried in his own kitchen with his coffee going cold on the counter. I didn't know what to do with it at first. Then I sat down across from him, and we stayed in that kitchen for another hour, talking in a way we hadn't since I was 12 years old. It's not fixed. I want to be clear about that. Families don't fix in a night or a conversation, or even a series of them. But something that had been closed for a long time began to open, slowly, the way things open when the pressure on them finally releases. Marcus and I had dinner with Robert Calloway and his wife the following month. They were warm, funny people who had been married for 38 years and still finished each other's sentences. At the end of the evening, Robert told Marcus and me that the San Joaquin program had just been approved for expansion into 2 additional counties. On the drive home, Marcus said, "Your sister's wedding is going to be interesting." I laughed. Genuinely. The first real laugh I had had about my family in a long time. "Where do you think they'll seat us?" I asked. He reached over and found my hand in the dark. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We'll know where we actually belong." I thought about all the times I had walked into a room full of people who were measuring each other, all the times I had been found wanting by a set of criteria I had never agreed to. And I thought about a Tuesday night 2 months ago, a man named Gerald who had gone into cardiac arrest in a grocery store parking lot, and the 7 minutes it took me to bring him back, and the way his daughter looked at me in the hospital hallway afterward, like I was something she didn't have words for. My father had called my work a detour. Gerald's daughter had called it a miracle. I had learned by then whose voice to carry home with me.